Chodesh Tov Rabotai. We are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Terumot. We are up to Perik Dal Mishnah Gimel. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Bracha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. Rabotai, as an introduction to today's Mishnah, we know according to Torah law, there is no minimum proportion that has to be separated as terumah. Rather, even a single kernel is enough for a large pile of grain. The Chachamim, however, made set proportions which are going to be defined in this Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Shi'ul terumah. The following is the measure of terumah that should be separated. Ein yafa echad me'arba'im. A generous proportion is 1 part in 40, which is 1/40th of the crop, which equals about 2.5%. Now, the Chachamim, we're going to see in the Mishnah, they identified 3 types of people: the generous, the average, and then the people that don't spend a lot of money, they hoard money, which we call miserly, a miser. A person who wants to give terumah generously should designate a 40th of his produce as terumah. The proportions that we're going to see for the average and then for the stingy person is going to be brought down later on in the Mishnah. Bet Shammai Amrim, Bet Shammai say, Mishloshim, a generous proportion is 1 part in 30, 1/30th. They disagree with the Tana Kama. The Mishnah continues, Va'benonit mechamishim, the first Tana continues, and the medium proportion is 1 part in 50, 1/50th, which is about 2%. Va'ra'a mishishim, and the miserly proportion is 1 part in 60, about 1.7% of the produce. Now the Mefarshim bring down, Bet Shammai also disagree with these proportions, even though the Mishnah doesn't bring it down. According to them, the Rav and the Rambam in his commentaries say the average person should give at least 1/40th and the miserly person at least 1/50th. Machloket between Tana Kama and Bet Shammai, the proportions. But again, Tana Kama said generous is 1/40th of the produce, average is 1/50th, and miserly is 1/60th. The Mishnah now discusses what happens if a person separated less than his usual proportion. Taram ve'ala biyado echad mishishim teruma ve'no tzarich litrom. If someone separated terumah and 1 part in 60 came up in his hand, instead of his usual proportion of 1/40th or 1/50th, he separated 1/60th. Terumah, it is terumah. Ve'no tzarich litrom, and he doesn't have to separate any more terumah, because since the amount that he separated meets the minimum requirement made by the Chachamim, it is fully valid and it releases the remaining produce from being subject to the terumah obligation. Chazar ve'osif, therefore the Mishnah adds, if he went back and added to the terumah he already separated, the additional amount is not terumah, therefore chayad b'ma'asrot, it is tevel that is subject to ma'asrot like it was before. And the Rav explains, when the 1/60th portion of terumah was removed from the pile, it released the rest of the pile from any terumah requirement. So no more terumah can be separated from the pile. Therefore, the extra amount that he tried to designate as terumah is not terumah at all, but is the same as the pile from which it was taken. Namely, it's tevet from which ma'asrot must still be separated. Ala biyado mishishim ve'echad. If, however, 1 part in 61 came up in his hand, which is less than any of the 3 proportions made by the Chachamim. For example, the Rav says, out of a pile of 61 se'ah, he separated only 1 se'ah as terumah. That doesn't follow any of the amounts said by the Chachamim. Terumah, it is terumah. Ve'achzor ve'itrom kemo shu. But he must go back and separate more until he reaches his usual amount of terumah. Now, follow the example that we said about a pile of 61. If he usually separates 1/60th, then the 1 se'ah designated as terumah covers only 60 of the 61 se'ah in the pile. Now he has to separate 1/60th of his se'ah for the remaining se'ah. And if he usually separates 1/50th, the se'ah designated covers only 50 of the 61 se'ah, and he must designate 1/50th of the remaining 11 se'ah. B'midah mishkal u'minyan. And this additional terumah doesn't have to be estimated like we usually required, but it can be measured. It can be measured precisely by volume, by weight, or by count. And the Mefarshim explain, we learned earlier that a person has to estimate the amount of terumah that he wants to separate. He cannot use exact methods of measuring, like weighing, measuring the volume, or counting the pieces of fruit. We learned this in chapter 1, Mishnah 7. This Mishnah is teaching us that this halakha applies only to an ordinary separation of terumah and not to the additional separation that we discuss here. Since the purpose of the additional separation is to reach a specific amount, the Chachamim allowed it to be measured precisely. Now, in general, Terumah is to be removed from the produce that is near the pile of tevel for which it's being separated. We spoke about this earlier, chapter 2, Mishnah 1. According to this Tana, this rule applies here as well, where one is adding to Terumah that was already designated. The next Tana, however, disagrees, and that's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, Av Shalom Min HaMukaf, the additional portion of Terumah can be separated even from produce that is not near the pile. And the Mefarshim explain, according to Rav Yehuda, the reason that Terumah is to be taken from the produce near the pile is that otherwise estimating the correct amount of Terumah would be difficult. Therefore, the requirement only applies to the initial separation of Terumah, which has to be estimated, and not to the, this requirement applies only to the initial separation of Terumah, which has to be estimated, but not to the additional separation of Terumah, which can be measured exactly. However, like we said, the Tana Kama disagrees, and the Rav tells us, and the halakha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. Rather, the additional portion of terumah is to be separated from produce that is near the pile. That is in Rabotai of Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Daled now is going to discuss a case where an owner of produce appointed someone as his legal agent, his shliach, to separate terumah on his behalf. But he didn't tell the shliach whether he wants him to separate a generous amount, 1/40th, medium 1/50th, or miserly 1/60th. The Mishnah says, "Haomer li shlucho tzeh utrom." If one says to his shliach, go out, to his messenger, his agent, go out and separate terumah from my crop. Torem kedaato shel baal habayit. The agent should separate terumah according to the owner's character, meaning he should separate 1/40th of the crop for a generous person, 1/60th for a miserly person, and 1/50th for an average person. If he does not know the owner's character, he separates an amount of terumah that corresponds to the medium portion, echad mechamishim, which is 1 part in 50. And the Mefarshim say, if the agent cannot tell whether the owner is generous, average, or miserly, he should assume that the owner is like most people who separate 1/50th who are average. Now the Mishnah discusses what happens if the owner is an average person who gives 1/50th, but the agent separated more than a 50th, like a generous, or less than a 50th, more than a 50th, like a miserly, or less than a 50th, like generous. Pichet asara, ohosif asara, terumato terumah. If he mistakenly subtracted 10 from the 50 parts out of which the owner usually separates 1 part of terumah, meaning he separated 1 part in 40, the case, let's say, the Rav explains, the owner is an average person and usually gives 1/50th of terumah, but the agent thought that he's a generous person and he separated 1/40th. Or he mistakenly added 10 to the 50 parts out of which the owner usually separates 1 part of terumah, meaning he separated 1 part in 60. Again, the shliach here judged that the owner is miserly and therefore he separated only 1/60th. The Mishnah says, terumato terumah. His terumah is a valid terumah because since the shliach made his best judgment of the owner's character and separated an amount befitting that judgment, he did what he was asked to do. Therefore, the designation is effective. And the Mefarshim explained to us, since the owner didn't tell the agent how much terumah to separate, he implied that he's going to rely on the shliach's judgment of his character, agreeing to accept the shliach's decision. The shliach then made an honest estimation of the owner's character, and he separated the amount that the rabbis established for that type of person. Since the shliach obeyed the owner's instructions, his terumah designation is effective and valid. However, if he knew that the owner usually, the shliach knew that the owner usually separates 1 part in 50, and he intentionally added even 1 to the number of parts for which the owner usually separates, meaning he separated 1 part in 51, and terumato terumah, his terumah is not a valid terumah because he did not carry out the owner's instructions. The Mefarshim explain, if the shliach knew the owner's character, but he deliberately separated less than the amount established by the chachamim for someone of that character, he did not carry out what the owner implied he should do, because he deviated from the owner's implied instructions, he cannot be considered the owner's shliach, and therefore the terumah he separated is invalid. That is en Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody should have a chodesh tov. Baruch Adonai leolam. Amen v'amen.